The cold in the high country of the Rockies has a different bite. It's thin, sharp, and steals the breath from your lungs before you can even form a cloud of vapor. I felt it scraping at the back of my throat as I lay prone, the frozen pine needles digging into the canvas of my jacket. Below me, in a small clearing where the quaking aspens had shed their gold, stood my quarry, a 6-point bull elk, magnificent and oblivious. The crosshairs of my scope settled just behind its shoulder. My finger tightened on the trigger, my breathing slowing to a crawl. In this moment, there was only me, the elk, and the vast, indifferent wilderness of Stag's Leap. That's when I noticed it. The silence. It wasn't the usual quiet of the mountains, which is never truly quiet. There are always the chattering Steller's jays, the whisper of wind through the ponderosa pines, the distant skittering of a squirrel. But this was a profound, unnatural hush. The jays had gone mute. The wind held its breath. It was the kind of silence that precedes a predator's strike, a deep, listening void that prickled the hairs on my arms. The elk felt it too. Its head snapped up, ears swiveling like radar dishes, nostrils flaring as it tasted the air for a threat it couldn't place. My own senses, honed by 2 tours as an army scout, screamed at me. Something was wrong. Dangerously wrong. The elk was no longer the focus. Survival was. Slowly, I lowered the rifle, my gaze sweeping the tree line, the jumble of granite boulders to my left. The feeling of being watched was a physical pressure, an invisible weight pressing in from all sides. It felt like the entire forest had turned its collective attention on me, the intruder. The elk, deciding this was a game it wanted no part of, bolted into the dense timber with a crash of undergrowth that sounded like an explosion in the dead air. I didn't care. My attention was fixed on a rocky outcrop about 50 yards away. The shadows there seemed too deep, too solid. Then, a shadow detached itself from the rock. It moved with a fluid speed that defied its size. It was a wolf, but impossibly large. Its coat the color of storm clouds and winter dusk. It wasn't stalking or circling. It was charging a direct, suicidal assault. There was no hesitation, no animal caution, just pure, silent rage. In the fraction of a second I had, my brain processed the impossibilities. It was bigger than any gray wolf native to Colorado. Its gait was too powerful, and it showed absolutely no fear of a man with a rifle. Instinct, drilled into me by years of training, took over. The rifle came up to my shoulder in a single fluid motion. There was no time to aim properly, just to point and shoot. The report of the 30-06 was a physical blow, a thunderclap that shattered the oppressive silence into a million pieces. The wolf was mid-leap when the 180-grain slug slammed into its left shoulder. It twisted in the air with a sound that froze my blood. A high, sharp cry that was half animal shriek and half something horribly, recognizably human. It landed in a crumpled heap, a splash of dark blood stark against the pale aspen leaves. I chambered another round, my heart hammering against my ribs. My mind was reeling. A wolf attacking a human head-on? Unheard of. I approached cautiously, rifle ready, finger on the trigger. I needed to put it out of its misery. It was the hunter's way, the merciful thing to do. The wolf lay on its side, panting, its lifeblood seeping into the cold earth. I raised the rifle, the barrel aimed at its head, and then it looked at me. Our eyes met, and the world tilted on its axis. I expected the wild, yellow glare of a predator, the flat, cold fury of a cornered beast. But these eyes were not yellow. They were a deep, intelligent hazel, flecked with gold. They were full of a shocking, gut-wrenching pain, a piercing intelligence, and something that felt terrifyingly like accusation. There was no feral madness in that gaze, only a lucid agony that seemed to reach right into my soul and squeeze. It was the look of a person trapped inside an animal's body, begging for an understanding I couldn't possibly give. My arm grew heavy. The rifle barrel sagged towards the ground. Every fiber of my being, every lesson the wild had ever taught me, screamed to finish the job. This was a wounded predator, a danger. But I couldn't. I couldn't pull the trigger while those eyes were watching me. It felt less like an act of mercy and more like an execution. Against all reason, against every rule of the mountains, I made a decision. I lowered my rifle completely. The wolf watched my every move, its breathing ragged. I shrugged off my pack and pulled out my first aid kit, the heavy-duty one I carried for myself, not for animals. Unsheathing my knife, I cut a large square from the canvas tarp rolled on my pack. The wolf didn't so much as growl as I knelt beside it, my hands moving with a purpose I didn't understand. I packed the exit wound as best I could, wrapping the canvas tightly around its shoulder to staunch the bleeding, cinching it with cord. It was a clumsy, foolish effort, but it was all I could do. The wolf was a dead weight, far heavier than it looked. Using branches and more cord, I rigged a crude travois. With a grunt of effort, I began to drag the massive, wounded creature through the silent forest, back towards the smoke curling from the chimney of my cabin, a lonely outpost a few miles from the sleeping town of Stag's Leap. The weight of the wolf was immense, but it was nothing compared to the weight of its gaze, which I could still feel burning into my back. I didn't know what I had done, but I knew I had just broken a law far older than any written by man. The fire in the stone hearth was the only source of sound in my cabin, a steady rhythmic crackle against a backdrop of unnerving silence. On a thick wool blanket near the warmth, the she-wolf lay. Her breathing was shallow, a faint rasp in the quiet of the room. I'd managed to drag her inside without her showing a single tooth, a passivity that was more disturbing than any aggression could have been. Now her hazel eyes followed me, tracking my every movement as I paced the rough-hewn floorboards. They were luminous in the firelight, twin pools of knowing stillness. With a sigh, I filled a bowl with warm water and grabbed the antiseptic from my kit. The shotgun leaned against the wall next to my armchair, loaded and ready, a testament to the war raging in my head. Part of me, the pragmatic tracker, knew this was insane. I was harboring a wounded predator, a creature that had tried to kill me without provocation. But the other part, the part that had looked into those eyes, couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary animal. Kneeling beside her, I carefully unwrapped the makeshift bandage. The wound was worse than I'd thought. The bullet had passed clean through, shattering the scapula. I could see the splintered ends of bone through the torn muscle. For a wild animal, this was a death sentence. Infection, starvation, or another predator would claim it within days. Yet as I began to clean the wound, she barely flinched. She endured my touch with a stoicism that felt profoundly unnatural. A low whimper escaped her throat, a sound of pure pain, but there was no snarl, no attempt to bite the hand that was causing her agony. I worked quickly, cleaning the wound as thoroughly as I could before applying a salve and a fresh, clean bandage. She watched me the whole time, her gaze unwavering, her breathing the only sign of the torment she must be in. Night fell like a shroud, thick and absolute. I settled into my leather armchair, the shotgun resting across my lap. Sleep was an impossibility. I was listening listening for the familiar sounds of the mountain night. The distant howl of a coyote pack, the deep hoot of a great horned owl, the rustle of a porcupine in the brush outside. But there was nothing. The profound silence that had descended upon the forest during the day had followed me home. It pressed against the log walls of my cabin, a suffocating blanket of absolute stillness. It was as if every living creature for miles around had either fled or been struck dead. I got up and walked to the window, peering out into the impenetrable dark. The moon was hidden behind a thick bank of clouds, and my small patch of cleared land was swallowed by an inky blackness. It felt alive. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light, it was a presence. I had the unshakable certainty that I was being observed, that beyond the reach of my porch light, the forest was filled with watchers. This wasn't the paranoia of a man alone in the woods. It was the cold, hard certainty of a soldier in hostile territory. I felt like I was in a besieged outpost, a tiny island of light in an ocean of predatory darkness. And they were watching me and my guest. I must have drifted off in the chair, because I woke with a start to the first gray light of dawn filtering through the window. My neck was stiff, the shotgun heavy on my thighs. My first thought was of the wolf. I looked over to the hearth. She was still there, but something was different. Her breathing was no longer shallow and ragged, it was deep and even. She was awake, her head resting on her paws, but those hazel eyes were fixed on me. Driven by a mix of dread and morbid curiosity, I knelt beside her again. I gently peeled back a corner of the new bandage. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. The edges of the horrific wound, which should have been swollen and inflamed, were puckered and dry. The angry red had faded to a pale pink. The flesh was knitting itself back together with a speed that defied every law of biology I knew. It looked less like a day-old gunshot wound and more like a week-old surgical incision. It was impossible, utterly, terrifyingly impossible. She must have sensed my shock. She shifted her weight slightly and let out a soft whine. Our eyes met again. The look she gave me wasn't one of gratitude, not in the simple way a dog might thank its master. It was a complex, unsettling mix of emotions I could read as clearly as words on a page. There was fear, a sense of binding obligation, and an ancient, soul-deep sorrow that seemed too vast for any single creature to contain. It was a silent conversation that left me feeling cold and exposed. Then, her head lifted. Her gaze shifted from me to the closed cabin door, and then to the dark wall of forest beyond the window. Another low whine rumbled in her chest, but this one was different. It wasn't a sound of pain. It was an answer to a call I couldn't hear, a summons that vibrated on a frequency only she could perceive. She was telling me, in the only way she could, that we were no longer alone. They knew where she was, and they were waiting. The she-wolf's unnatural recovery created a new urgent problem. She needed food and water, but more pressingly, I needed supplies. My stock of antibiotics was low, and if that wound, impossible as it was, somehow did get infected, I'd be useless. I left her 2 bowls, one with water and another with some leftover stew, which she regarded with a regal indifference. After securing every lock on the cabin door and barring the windows from the inside, I got in my truck. The gnawing feeling that I was making a terrible mistake, leaving her alone, was almost enough to make me turn back. The 10-mile drive into Stag's Leap felt different. The familiar mountain road, usually a comforting passage, seemed menacing. The trees crowded closer, their bare branches like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. The town itself was a small collection of buildings huddled in a valley, a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Today, that familiar coziness was gone, replaced by a low-grade hum of anxiety. I parked in front of Miller's General Store, the town's hub of commerce and gossip. Inside, the usual morning chatter was subdued. A few locals were gathered near the counter, their voices low and strained. Frank Hemlock, a grizzled old rancher whose face was a roadmap of his 70 years, was talking to Sheriff Brody. "It wasn't right, Dale," Frank was saying, his voice raspy. "Never heard a night so quiet. My cattle, they were spooked bad, pacing the fence line all night long, like the devil himself was walking the perimeter." Sheriff Brody, a man whose weary posture suggested he'd seen too much and slept too little, ran a hand over his face. "Probably a mountain lion passing through, Frank. Or a bear getting bold before hibernation. It's that time of year." "No lion ever made it that quiet," another man chimed in. "It was like the whole world was holding its breath. My dogs wouldn't even go out to pee. Just whined by the door, tail between their legs." I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The great silence. They'd all felt it. I was its epicenter, the cause of this spreading unease. I kept my head down, grabbing a basket and moving through the aisles, picking up bandages, hydrogen peroxide, a heavy-duty antibiotic for livestock that Annabelle, the town vet, sometimes sold under the table for emergencies, and a few cans of chili for myself. I felt their eyes on me, the way people in a small town look at the guy who lives alone in the mountains. Usually it was a look of mild curiosity. Today it felt like suspicion. They could sense something was off, and I was the outsider, the wild card. I paid for my items in cash, avoiding Sheriff Brody's inquisitive gaze, and made my escape. The drive back to the cabin was a race against a nameless dread. I pushed the old truck faster than I should have on the winding dirt roads, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. What if they had come for her while I was gone? What if the cabin was empty, or worse, torn apart? When I pulled up, everything looked as I'd left it. Smoke still drifted from the chimney. I unbarred the door with a sense of trepidation, my hand hovering over the pistol on my hip. The she-wolf was there, lying by the hearth. She'd drunk the water but hadn't touched the stew. She lifted her head as I entered, and for the first time, I thought I saw a flicker of something like relief in her eyes. The feeling was mutual. Just as I was unpacking the supplies, the shrill, jarring ring of my satellite phone cut through the quiet. It was a sound I rarely heard. I snatched it up. "Hayes? Ethan, it's Dale Brody." The sheriff's voice was stripped of its earlier dismissive tone. It was tight, strained. "I need you to come out to the Hemlock place. Right now." "What's wrong?" I asked, my blood turning to ice. "It's Frank," Brody said, and I could hear the wind whistling on his end of the line. His wife, Martha, called in a panic. He went out to check on the cattle an hour before sunrise. He never came back. 15 minutes later, I was at the Hemlock Ranch. The scene was chilling. A light frost covered the muddy ground, preserving every detail with perfect clarity. A set of footprints led from the back porch of the farmhouse towards the dark, looming wall of the forest. They were Frank Hemlock's heavy work boots. But next to them was another set of tracks that made no sense. They were barefoot, human, and they were heading in the same direction, deep into the woods. Sheriff Brody pointed his flashlight at the ground. "Martha swears he went out wearing his boots. We can't find them anywhere. As the best tracker in the county, I took the lead." following the strange double set of prints into the oppressive shadow of the pines. The boot prints were deep and even. The barefoot prints were lighter, almost delicate, as if the person walking was trying to be silent. The forest grew dense quickly, swallowing the daylight. We moved forward, the only sounds the crunch of our feet and our own ragged breathing. After about 100 yards, I stopped dead. I knelt, shining my own powerful flashlight on the ground. The trail ended. Not faded, not petered out. It just stopped. 1 second, there were 2 sets of tracks, booted and bare, marching into the woods. The next, there was just undisturbed pine needles and frozen earth. There were no signs of a struggle. No scuffed dirt, no broken branches, no drops of blood. It was as if Frank Hemlock and his mysterious companion had simply been plucked from the face of the earth, vanishing into thin air. Sheriff Brody swore under his breath, a harsh, ragged sound. "Where in God's name did he go?" I didn't have an answer. I stood up, my gaze sweeping the silent, watching trees. The cold I felt had nothing to do with the late autumn air. It was a deep, primal fear. This wasn't a missing person case. This was a disappearance. And I had a terrible sinking feeling that the answer was lying on a wool blanket in front of my fireplace. By midday, Stag's Leap was in a state of quiet panic. Sheriff Brody organized a search party, a grim-faced assembly of about 20 men, ranchers, loggers, and store owners, armed with hunting rifles and a growing sense of dread. Reluctantly, I agreed to lead it. My reputation as a tracker demanded it, but my conscience screamed in protest. I knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in my gut, that we weren't going to find Frank Hemlock. We were walking into the hunting grounds of whatever had taken him. We spread out in a loose line, combing the dense woods quadrant by quadrant. The forest, my home and my sanctuary, had transformed. It felt alien, hostile. The familiar paths seemed to twist in on themselves. The silence from the night before had lingered, a heavy, suffocating presence that muffled our calls and made the snap of every twig underfoot sound like a gunshot. The men, usually loud and boastful on a hunt, were quiet, their faces pale, their eyes constantly darting towards the deep shadows between the ancient Douglas firs. They felt it too. The feeling of being watched, of being outnumbered. Hours bled into one another. We found nothing. No scrap of clothing, no drop of blood. Not even a single broken branch to indicate Frank's passage past the point where his tracks had vanished. It was as if the forest had swallowed him whole. As the sun began its descent, painting the western sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, the temperature plummeted. The mood of the search party soured from anxious to fearful. "We should head back, Sheriff," one of the men said, his voice trembling slightly. "It'll be dark soon. Ain't safe to be out here." Brody, his face etched with frustration and exhaustion, reluctantly agreed. "All right, everyone back to the trucks. We'll start again at first light." The retreat was faster than the search, a barely controlled flight. The encroaching twilight played tricks on the eyes, turning stumps into crouching figures and gnarled branches into reaching claws. We were nearly back to the edge of the Hemlock property, the distant lights of the farmhouse a welcome beacon when it happened. A young man named Cody, barely 20, let out a choked gasp and froze, his hand flying up to point at the ridge overlooking the valley. "Oh my God, look." We all stopped, turning to follow his trembling finger, and we saw them. Against the darkening tapestry of the sky, arrayed along the crest of the hill, were eyes. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They were pairs of luminous, phosphorescent green orbs glowing with an internal fire. They didn't blink. They didn't move. They just hung there in the darkness, perfectly still, like malevolent constellations. This wasn't a pack of wolves or a herd of deer caught in our flashlights. This was a silent, disciplined army of predators watching us. They had been there the whole time, shadowing our every move, letting us search their territory, treating us with the patient contempt a cat shows a mouse. A collective wave of pure terror washed over our group. Someone near me started to pray in a ragged whisper. The feeling was no longer just of being watched. It was of being judged, of being weighed and measured as prey. The silent, unblinking stare of that multitude of eyes was a declaration of ownership. This was their mountain. We were just trespassing. Panic shattered our formation. It was a full-blown rout. Men who had lived their entire lives in these mountains, who prided themselves on their toughness, scrambled and stumbled over each other in a desperate race for the perceived safety of the farmhouse lights. The feeling of being hunted, of being hopelessly outmatched, was a primal terror that stripped away all reason. I ran with them, but my mind was racing elsewhere. My truck was parked closer to the road. While the others fled to the ranch, I peeled off, sprinting for my vehicle, my lungs burning. I didn't stop until I was inside, doors locked, engine roaring to life. I tore down the dirt road, leaving the chaos behind, driven by a single desperate need. I burst into my cabin, shotgun in hand, expecting the worst. The room was empty, save for the dying embers in the hearth. Then I saw her. The she-wolf was standing, not lying, near the center of the room. She stood on all four paws, her posture steady and strong. There was no trace of a limp. I looked at her left shoulder. Where a gaping, shattered wound had been just that morning, there was now only a patch of slightly disturbed fur over what looked like a long-healed scar. It was the final, horrifying confirmation of her impossible nature. She turned her head and looked at me, her hazel eyes filled with that same ancient sorrow. Then, she looked past me, through the window, towards the ridge where the glowing eyes had been. Her muzzle lifted, and from deep within her chest came a sound that was not a bark or a growl, but a low, mournful, and commanding howl. It was a long, single note of pure authority and profound sadness. It wasn't a call to attack. It was a command to stand down. And as I stood there, frozen in the middle of my cabin, I knew with absolute certainty that out on that dark ridge, hundreds of glowing green eyes had just blinked out as one, vanishing back into the night, obedient to the call of their wounded queen. A fragile, terrified peace settled over Stag's Leap. Sheriff Brody, his voice crackling with static over the CB radio, issued a stark command that echoed through every home in the valley. This is the sheriff's department. Everyone stay in your homes, lock your doors, bar your windows. Do not, under any circumstances, go outside. I repeat, do not go outside. The town held its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The siege had begun. In my cabin, I worked with a grim, focused energy, shoving my heaviest furniture against the door and windows. The she-wolf watched me from the hearth, a silent, impassive observer to my frantic preparations. Her howl had dismissed the army on the ridge, but I didn't believe for a second that it was over. That was a reprieve, not a retreat. The quiet that followed was heavier and more menacing than any sound could ever be. The attack, when it came, was not a slow, creeping horror. It was a sudden, violent explosion of chaos. It started on the outskirts of town, a distant scream cutting through the night, abruptly choked off. Then another, closer this time, followed by the sound of splintering wood and a chorus of deep guttural snarls. These weren't the howls of wolves. They were something far worse. The radio erupted in a cacophony of terror. "They're breaking down the door! Oh God, they're—" The transmission ended in a wet, tearing sound. Another voice, trembling with disbelief, screamed into his mic. "It's got hands. It's not an animal. It's got human hands. Sheriff, it's Miller, from the store. It's God, it's his face. I can see his face." A cold dread, sharper than any fear I'd felt in combat, coiled in my gut. I switched on the powerful floodlight I had mounted on the corner of my cabin, its beam cutting a stark white swath across my clearing. And then I saw one. It was sprinting across the open ground on 2 legs, but it was hunched over, its posture a grotesque parody of a hyena. Its body was long and emaciated, covered in patchy, dark fur, but its limbs were disturbingly wrong. Its legs were digitigrade, like a canine's, but its arms were long and sinewy, ending in pale, 5-fingered human hands, now tipped with thick black claws. Its head was a nightmare collage of wolf and man, its jaw unhinged in a permanent, drooling snarl filled with needle-like teeth. But the eyes were the worst part. They glowed with that same hellish green luminescence I'd seen on the ridge. It saw the light, saw me in the window, and let out a chittering, high-pitched shriek before melting back into the darkness. The sight of it burned itself onto my brain. This wasn't a curse that turned men into beasts. This was something that twisted them, that warped and remade them into something new and utterly profane. The sounds of the slaughter in town intensified. Gunshots echoed through the valley, sporadic and desperate. The ringing of breaking glass was followed by screams that climbed the scale into pure agony. It was brutally clear that the thin wooden walls of a modern home were no defense against such creatures. They were being picked off, house by house. Then, Brody's voice, strained but still in command, cut through the panic on the radio. "Everyone! Everyone who can hear me! Fall back to the town hall! I repeat, all survivors, get to the town hall. The walls are stone, 2 feet thick. It's our only chance." It was a desperate last-ditch plan, a death run. For a moment, I considered my options. I was miles from town, relatively safe in my fortified cabin. But I couldn't just sit here and listen to the people I knew get torn apart. And I knew they couldn't hold out forever. Sooner or later, the pack would remember me. I looked at the she-wolf. She was standing now, her body tense, listening to the distant massacre. There was no way I could take her with me. She was too big, too conspicuous. And what would the terrified townsfolk do if I showed up with one of them? They'd shoot us both on sight. The decision was a bitter pill. I had saved her, and now I had to abandon her. With a heavy heart, I grabbed my shotgun, a box of shells, and my pistol. I gave her one last look. Her hazel eyes met mine, and in them, I saw no judgment, only that same deep, unending sorrow. It felt like a farewell. I slipped out the back door, leaving her to her fate, and plunged into the woods. I moved parallel to the road, using the trees for cover, my senses on fire. The night was filled with monstrous shadows flitting between the houses. I saw one creature, its back horribly deformed, with sharp, bony spikes protruding through the torn fabric of a flannel shirt. I saw another dragging itself along the ground, its lower half still recognizably human in denim jeans, its upper body a twisted mass of fur and claws. I recognized the tattered remains of a jacket. It was what Frank Hemlock had been wearing. The town hall was in the center of town, its old stone clock tower a dark silhouette against the chaotic sky. The final 100 yards were an open square. I took a deep breath, said a prayer to a God I wasn't sure I believed in anymore, and ran. I sprinted across the open ground, shotgun held at the ready, the screams and snarls of a living hell echoing all around me. A dark shape lunged from an alleyway, and I fired from the hip without breaking stride. The blast of buckshot sent it tumbling back into the shadows with an inhuman shriek. The heavy oak doors of the town hall were thrown open just enough for me to squeeze through, then slammed shut behind me, the sound of a heavy bar dropping into place echoing like a tomb ceiling. I had made it. But as I leaned against the cold wood, catching my breath and listening to the horrors outside, I knew this wasn't safety. It was just a temporary cage. The inside of the Stag's Leap Town Hall smelled of fear, gun smoke, and damp stone. About 30 survivors were huddled in the main chamber, their faces illuminated by the flickering beams of battery-powered lanterns. I saw Sheriff Brody, a bloody bandage wrapped around his forearm, directing 2 men as they shoved a heavy wooden desk against the main doors. I saw Annabelle, the town vet, her face pale but her hands steady as she tended to a wounded man. I saw families clinging to each other, their eyes wide with a terror that had hollowed them out. A quick scan of the room was a silent, brutal roll call of the dead. The Millers from the general store were gone. The Henderson family, who lived on the east side of town, were missing. Old Man Peabody, the town drunk, was nowhere to be seen. Each empty space in the small community was a fresh, gaping wound. The realization of the town's losses washed over the room in waves of choked sobs and stunned silence. We weren't a town anymore. We were a remnant. Outside, the creatures had changed their tactics. The frenzied, chaotic assault gave way to a patient, psychological siege. They surrounded the stone building, their numbers unknown. We could hear them out there, the scrape of claws on the thick oak doors, the soft thud of a body bumping against the stone walls. Worst of all were the faces at the windows. The windows were too high to break through easily, but the creatures would leap up, their glowing green eyes and twisted faces appearing for a brief, horrifying moment before they dropped back into the darkness. It was a war of attrition, designed to break our spirits before they broke our bodies. "That thing," a woman whispered, her voice cracking. "The one at the west window." That was my husband's brother, Bill. I recognized his eyes before they changed. A man sitting on the floor, rocking back and forth, nodded numbly. I saw what was left of Martha Hemlock. She was wearing her favorite rose-print nightgown. This was the deepest, most insidious layer of the horror. These weren't just monsters from some forgotten legend. They were our neighbors, our friends, our families. They were the people we'd shared coffee with, the people whose kids played with our own. Now they were clawing at the walls, their minds erased, their bodies twisted into instruments of slaughter. The fear of being killed was eclipsed by the terror of being killed by someone you once loved. Finding a quiet corner, I finally told Sheriff Brody and Annabelle everything. I told them about the unnaturally large she-wolf, the head-on attack, her human-like eyes, the impossible wound, and its even more impossible healing. I told them how her howl had seemed to command the watchers on the ridge. As I spoke, the pieces began to click into place, forming a picture more terrible than I could have imagined. It was Annabelle who gave it a name. Her usual scientific pragmatism was gone, replaced by a remembered dread. "My grandmother was half Ute," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She told stories about this place, about the deep woods. It wasn't about a bite, not a disease like you see in the movies. It was a bloodline, a heritage, a pack that could absorb people. Not lycanthropy, but something older, something tied to the land itself. A bloodline. Brody grunted, wincing as he checked the bandage on his arm. What the hell does that mean? It means they aren't just making monsters, Annabelle continued, her eyes wide with dawning comprehension. She looked directly at me. That she-wolf you found, Ethan, the human eyes, the regeneration, she wasn't just another member of the pack. The weight of her unspoken words fell upon the small group. I saw the understanding spread across Brody's face, a mask of grim horror. They weren't just rampaging. They weren't just killing for sport or for food. They had a purpose. They were methodical. "They're looking for her," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "They're tearing the town apart because they're looking for her." Annabelle nodded slowly. "She must be vital to them. The daughter of the Alpha, maybe. Or a mate, someone carrying a pure strain of whatever they are. A queen." The full, crushing weight of my actions crashed down on me. I hadn't just shot a wolf. I had interfered in a dynastic struggle, a tribal law I had no concept of. I had stolen their princess from the tower. And in my foolish attempt to save one life, I had brought this apocalyptic wrath down upon Stag's Leap. The blood of every person who had died tonight was on my hands. The creatures outside weren't just a pack, they were a posse. And they wouldn't leave until they got back what was theirs. A new silence descended, more profound and terrifying than the quiet in the woods had been. The scratching at the doors ceased. The fleeting faces in the windows vanished. The pack had withdrawn, melting back into the shadows. But this was no retreat. It was the calm at the eye of the storm, a coiled tension that vibrated in the very stones of the town hall. It felt like the collective intake of breath before a final devastating scream. We all knew they were still out there watching, waiting. This was a calculated pause, and it was shredding what was left of our nerves. "She's the key," Annabelle murmured, thinking aloud, piecing together the fragments of folklore and the horrifying reality outside. "If she's as important as we think, a pureblood, an Alpha's mate, a bride as the old stories would call her, then her loss is not just an inconvenience to them, it's an existential threat. They can't continue their line without her." My guilt was a physical thing, a crushing weight on my chest that made it hard to breathe. "I shot her," I said, my voice low and hoarse. "I took her from them. This is all my fault." Sheriff Brody put a hand on my shoulder, his grip surprisingly firm. "You didn't know, Ethan. You saw a wounded creature and you did a humane thing. You couldn't have known you were kicking the world's biggest hornet's nest." His words were meant to comfort, but they didn't. Every scream I'd heard tonight played on a loop in my head, a direct result of my misplaced mercy. The silence was then shattered by a sound that was unlike anything we had heard before. It wasn't a howl, a snarl, or a shriek. It was a deep, resonant, guttural roar that seemed to emanate from the very earth. It was a sound of absolute, unquestionable authority. It vibrated through the floorboards, thrummed in our bones, and rattled the lanterns on their hooks. It wasn't a sound of rage, it was a sound of command. It was the voice of a king. "To the windows," Brody ordered, his own voice tight with a new kind of fear. Slowly, we crept to the tall, arched windows, peering over the sills into the moonlit town square. The pack was there, emerging from the alleyways and shadows, but they kept their distance, forming a wide, silent circle. They were no longer a chaotic mob. They were a disciplined army awaiting their general. And into the center of that circle, into the stark, open space illuminated by the moonlight, stepped their leader. Every other creature we had seen was a twisted mockery of nature. This one was its terrifying apotheosis. He was huge, standing a full head and shoulders taller than the rest, and he stood fully upright, not hunched like the others. His posture was proud, regal, radiating an aura of immense power and ancient intelligence. His body was a roadmap of old battles, covered in a latticework of thick silvery scars that crisscrossed his dark fur. But it was his head that held us mesmerized in horror. From his skull grew a crown of jagged, blackened bone. It wasn't something he wore, it was part of him, erupting from his brow and temples in a series of twisted, antler-like spurs. He was the Bone King of this nightmare court. He didn't look at his pack. He didn't look at the carnage around him. His head was raised, and his glowing green eyes, brighter and more intense than any of the others, were fixed directly on the town hall. He stood there, perfectly still, a statue of primal fury and absolute control. He wasn't attacking. He wasn't posturing or roaring again. He was simply waiting. His silent, unblinking stare conveyed a message more clearly than any words ever could. It was a demand, a summons, an ultimatum written in the language of predator and prey, a language that every soul huddled inside that stone building understood instinctively. Give me back what you have taken. Give me back my bride. The Alpha's silent demand hung in the air, more menacing than any threat. He was a general and he knew the art of war. He didn't need to waste his soldiers' energy on a frontal assault against stone walls. Not yet. He had a more effective weapon: terror. With an almost imperceptible flick of his head, he gave a command. Instantly, two of the smaller, leaner creatures detached from the circle. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized grace, sprinting towards the east side of the town hall. They leaped, claws scrabbling for purchase on the stone, and latched onto the heavy wooden barricade we had nailed over one of the lower windows. Then they began to tear. The sound was sickening. The screech of nails being ripped from century-old wood. The splintering crack of thick planks being shredded like cardboard. They weren't trying to get in. Not really. The opening was too small. The barricade too thick. This was a demonstration. A show of force to remind us how easily they could get to us if their king gave the word. Inside, we could only watch, paralyzed, as they methodically dismantled our defenses piece by agonizing piece. The ammunition count was perilously low. We had maybe 50 rounds between all of us. Not enough to fight our way out. Not even enough to hold off a determined assault for more than a few minutes. Sheriff Brody was slumped against a wall, his face pale from blood loss, his pistol lying loosely in his lap. A woman was openly weeping now, her quiet sobs the only sound besides the relentless destruction at the window. We had reached the end of our rope. They would toy with us until dawn, and then when their leader grew bored, they would tear us apart. I stared out the window, my gaze locked on the Alpha. He stood unmoving, a figure of mythic horror, his bone crown stark against the night sky. I saw the raw, absolute power in him, the unyielding will. Then my gaze drifted to the faces of the people around me. I saw Annabelle trying to comfort a small, terrified child who was hiding behind her mother's legs. I saw the weary, defeated slump of Sheriff Brody. These people were going to die. They were going to die horrible deaths because I had brought a wounded animal into my home. The choice was no choice at all. It was a simple, brutal equation of survival. Her life, or all of ours. To hand her over felt like a profound betrayal. I had saved her, treated her wounds, shared the shelter of my home. She had trusted me. But to let everyone in this room die to protect her, that was a sin I couldn't live with. My mistake had a price, and it was becoming terrifyingly clear that I was the only one who could pay it. I looked back at the Alpha. Our eyes met across the square. It felt like he could see right through the stone walls, right into my soul. I felt him read the conflict in my mind, the dawning, terrible resolution. And in a gesture so subtle I almost missed it, the great monstrous head tilted slightly to the side. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, a confirmation. Yes, it seemed to say, "You understand. Bring her to me." The decision solidified in my gut, hard and cold as a river stone. I turned away from the window. The two creatures finished their work, ripping the last plank from the window frame, and then, as if satisfied, they loped back to rejoin the circle, leaving the gaping dark hole as a final warning. I walked over to Sheriff Brody. "Dale," I said, my voice low but steady. "I have to go back. I have to get her." He looked up at me, his eyes clouded with pain and exhaustion. "Ethan, you'll never make it." "He'll let me," I said, nodding towards the window. "This isn't about us anymore. It's about her. I need a diversion. Everything you've got, aimed at the back of the building. Make them think we're trying to break out that way." Brody stared at me for a long moment, then gave a slow, grim nod. "Give us 2 minutes." I moved to the main door, checking the load in my Colt 745, the spare magazine cold in my hand. I pulled my knife from its sheath on my belt. This wasn't a rescue mission. It was a delivery. And I had no illusions about what would happen to the delivery boy once the package was signed for. This was a one-way ticket. As the others scrambled to the rear windows, preparing to make as much noise as they could, I took one last look around the room. My eyes settled on the little girl, who was now peering at me from behind her mother's skirt. Her wide, tear-filled eyes held all the innocence that was being torn apart tonight. My resolve hardened into granite. I couldn't save myself, but maybe, just maybe I could save her. And for a man with as much blood on his hands as I had, that would have to be enough. "Now!" Brody's voice bellowed from the back of the hall. The diversion was an eruption of desperate noise. The last of our ammunition was unleashed in a ragged, furious volley from the rear windows. The remaining survivors, armed with nothing but terror and adrenaline, began screaming and hammering on the back doors with chairs and pieces of broken furniture. They even threw one of Annabelle's makeshift fire bombs, a bottle of antiseptic alcohol with a lit rag, which burst in a brief, brilliant flash of blue flame in the alley behind the hall. It worked. The effect on the pack was immediate. Their disciplined circle broke as the majority of the creatures snarled and spun, their attention drawn to the sudden chaos. Like a pack of hounds drawn to a cornered fox, they surged towards the back of the building, a wave of dark fur and glowing eyes. This was my chance. While the pack's attention was diverted, I nodded to the man at the door. He lifted the heavy bar, and I slipped out into the cold night air. The Alpha hadn't moved. He stood in the center of the square, flanked by a handful of his largest, most scarred lieutenants, his royal guard. They watched me, their green eyes burning in the darkness, but they made no move to stop me. The Bone King had given his silent permission. I was beneath his notice. Only my cargo mattered. I didn't look back. I ran. My feet pounded the cold, deserted street, my breath coming in ragged, burning bursts. I plunged into the familiar darkness of the forest path leading to my cabin, moving with a speed born of pure desperation. The woods were alive with watchers. I could feel their presence on all sides. a silent escort seeing me on my way. They were letting me pass, a ghost moving through their territory on the king's business. The miles to my cabin felt like an eternity. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow that danced at the edge of my vision threatened to send me sprawling in terror. But they left me alone. I was on a leash, and the Alpha held the end of it. I burst through the door of my cabin, my pistol raised, half expecting an ambush. But the room was just as I had left it, quiet and still. And in the center of the room, waiting for me, was the she-wolf. She was standing, calm and poised, as if she had known I was coming. There was no fear in her hazel eyes, no anger at being abandoned. There was only a deep, sorrowful understanding and a fatalistic resignation. She knew her role in this bloody drama. There was no need for a rope or a leash. I simply opened the door and stepped back outside. "It's time," I said, the words feeling hollow and absurd. She walked past me, out of the cabin and into the night without a moment's hesitation. I fell into step beside her, and we began the long, silent walk back to town. We moved through the woods not as captor and captive, but as two beings walking towards a shared, grim destiny. Her paws made no sound on the carpet of pine needles. The moonlight filtered through the canopy, dappling her dark fur in silver. In that moment, removed from the horror and the bloodshed, I could see the wild, tragic beauty of her, a creature caught between two worlds. We emerged from the tree line and onto the town square. The scene was a frozen tableau. The diversion at the back of the hall had died down. The pack had returned, reforming their silent circle. And in the center, the Alpha waited, a monument of scarred flesh and bone. As we stepped into the open, a low rumble went through the assembled pack, a sound of collective anticipation. I stopped at the edge of the circle, but the she-wolf continued walking. She padded gracefully across the square, her head held high, directly towards the Alpha. She stopped before him, lowered her head, and rubbed her cheek against his massive, furred leg in a gesture of submission and familiarity. The Alpha let out a low, guttural sound, a deep vibration that was not a growl but something akin to a sigh of profound relief. He lowered his huge, clawed hand and rested it gently on the back of her neck. The king had his queen back. The deal was done. My part in this was over. I stood there, exposed and empty-handed, waiting for the inevitable. The Alpha's head lifted, and his burning gaze fell upon me. This was it. The moment of payment. The Alpha held my gaze for a long, silent moment. I could feel the weight of his ancient intelligence, the cold appraisal of the insignificant human who had caused him so much trouble. I braced myself for the signal, for the tearing claws and snapping jaws of his pack. This was the price for Stag's Leap's survival, a price I had already agreed to pay. But the signal never came. The Alpha broke eye contact, turned his back on me with an air of absolute dismissal, and gave a low grunt. With him in the lead and the she-wolf trotting faithfully at his side, the pack began to move. They didn't run. They simply receded. They flowed like smoke into the alleys and shadows, melting back into the forest from which they came. There was no sound, no final howl of victory. They just vanished, as if they had been a collective nightmare from which the town was finally waking. In less than a minute, the square was empty. They were gone. The first rays of dawn were beginning to bleed over the eastern peaks, painting the sky in pale, watery shades of gray and pink. The light touched the broken doors, the shattered windows, the dark stains on the street. Slowly, tentatively, the The heavy doors of the town hall creaked open. The survivors emerged, blinking in the new light like prisoners released from a dungeon. They saw the carnage, the empty square, and then they saw me, standing alone. Their faces were a mixture of disbelief, fear, profound gratitude, and a sliver of suspicion. The nightmare was over. A wave of collective relief, so powerful it was almost a physical force, washed over the small group. It was immediately followed by grief, as sobs broke out for the friends and family who had been lost to the night. The town was saved, but it was a wounded, broken thing. But something was wrong. My scout's instincts, the same ones that had screamed at me in the woods before this all began, were tingling again. My eyes scanned the perimeter of the square, the dark edge of the forest where the pack had disappeared. They were all gone. All but one. A lone figure stood just within the shadow of the first line of pines, almost perfectly concealed. It hadn't left with the others. It was watching. As I stared, the figure took a hesitant step forward, out of the deepest shadow and into the dim morning light. My blood ran cold. It was a man. He was wearing the tattered, shredded remains of a plaid shirt and muddy work pants. He was gaunt and pale, his limbs moving with a stiff, unnatural awkwardness. It was Frank Hemlock. He stood there at the edge of the woods, a ghost returned from his own grave. Slowly, he lifted his head, and his eyes found mine across the empty square. They were no longer the familiar, sharp blue eyes of the cantankerous old rancher I'd known for years. They were glowing with the same faint, hellish phosphorescence as the others, a dull, sickly green. He looked at me, a long, unblinking stare that seemed to see right through me. He didn't snarl. He didn't threaten. He just looked. Then, in a gesture so small it was almost imperceptible, he gave me a slight, slow nod. It wasn't a nod of thanks for saving the town. It was something else. A nod of acknowledgement. A shared secret. A quiet, terrifying thank you for delivering the Queen, for adding a new, strong member to their sprawling, hidden family. Then he turned without a sound and vanished back into the trees, becoming just another shadow among the thousands. The survivors were celebrating their deliverance, but I couldn't move. I understood now. The pack had left, their purpose fulfilled. But they had left a sentry behind, an observer, and he knew who I was. He knew what I had done. The war for Stag's Leap was over, but my own personal hunt had just begun, and I was no longer sure which one of us was the hunter and which was the prey.